Well, hello, Dr. Rob Kiltz. How you doing today? A little conversations today to talk about your health and wellness and lifestyles. And I'm really excited today to have Zach Bitter to talk about his lifestyle and motivation and things he's done to keep him motivated. And I know that he's had many records in the ultra marathons and things like that. But I'm inspired to have him on today. And so welcome, Zach, and thanks for being on today.
Yeah, thanks a bunch for having me.
Well, I want to talk to you a lot about, what's motivated you to run these marathons and keep going. I think that's the most important part to this story is the mindset and motivation.
Yeah, it's been an interesting path, I will say. I think running was something that I got interested in at a pretty early age, but didn't take it overly seriously until end of kind of high school, early college years. And that's where I started to kind of look at some of the more detailed things around it. And that kind of drove a lot of the motivation. I've certainly pulled from the things I've learned from running to help with motivation and things like that in other areas of life. So yeah, the ultra marathoning is just kind of a byproduct of loving to run enough to get addicted to it to the degree where you want to find yourself on a track running 100 miles or wherever you happen to do it. And, there's just, like I said, a lot of life lessons in there.
Well, so staying inspired is really important. You're an educator. I noticed you went to Wisconsin. What was University of Wisconsin? Is there a day job besides running, motivation, coaching? Just curious about your overall lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so running was definitely just a hobby at first. I competed Division III at UW Stevens Point, and really learned to kind of love running there. And then my original career path was teaching. So I spent a couple of years teaching middle school, and then a couple of years teaching high school age students before kind of building up my coaching business and getting an opportunity to kind of race professionally. So it was, I was at a bit of a crossroads at 2015 where I felt like if I wanted to really be at my full capacity as a teacher, I'd have to maybe step away a little bit from how much time and energy I was spending on coaching and running. Or if I wanted to fully explore what I was capable of running and really build out my coaching business, I'd have to kind of step away from teaching. And since an athletic career tends to be a little shorter in length in most cases, I figured that was probably the one to target for now. And teaching would be something I could always go back to if I wanted to or needed to down the road. And so I packed my bags in Wisconsin in the summer of 2015, headed out to California. And that's kind of where I started my professional running career.
So essentially coaching, teaching, I think you're doing the same thing in some ways, but
Yeah.
maybe you're touching more people at any one time. And you have a coaching website, a blog. Tell us a little bit about that and how you inspire people in that area.
Yeah. So I think like the interesting thing is like the sport of ultra marathoning is a niche enough of a sport that it's tough to really bank on your racing career to be like your career essentially. I mean, it's not like some of the bigger sports where you can make enough while doing it and have a pension waiting for you. It's like you usually can make enough to get by while you're doing it, but you got to have a game plan for post racing career in most cases. So coaching was something I did while I was teaching. So I was definitely interested in it. And, the one-on-one individualized coaching was something that really was appealing to me. And that's kind of where I started kind of digging in with that. So yeah, my website, I offer a variety of different coaching packages, some for people who just want a plan that kind of follows my philosophy. Others want a little more like hands-on approach, and they'll sign up for like a more personalized plan where I'll build it around their lifestyle, their goal event, and we'll talk and email and stuff and make sure everything is more day-to-day than it is kind of just standardized towards my approach. And that's where it gets fun for me. Like you said, I didn't really want to leave teaching because I didn't like it. So being able to kind of carry over some of that type of stuff that I learned from that career path into, a passion of mine has been a really rewarding experience.
So tell me a little about the dietary habits that you practiced. I've seen a little bit on carnivore and a little on keto, and I'm curious on what your take on different dietary approaches in order to sort of fuel a body to do something that only a very small percentage of people can do.
Yeah, I got really interested in nutrition, I think, when I started taking running more seriously. And when I first kind of took a swing at it, it was, you just look at what endurance runners are eating, and you're going to see a lot of like higher to moderate to high carbohydrate approaches. So that's kind of where I started. I was,
Mhm.
a lot of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, that sort of stuff, 60, 70% of my intake. And that seemed to be okay for me while I was racing in college and for a few years after college. But once I started getting into ultra marathons, uh, I just things didn't seem like they were clicking the way that I wanted them to, and I wanted to keep doing the sport. I enjoyed it. I didn't necessarily want to step back from that if I didn't have to. So my first attempt at making things more optimized was to play around with nutrition, and that's kind of where I found a lower carb diet. And given that the races I'm doing are quite long, oftentimes 100 miles, you're just racing at a much lower intensity than you would for, say, some of the Olympic distance endurance events that folks are kind of familiar with, like 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, marathons, which tend to be done at a pace that's a little bit faster than most of your running.
Mhm.
Whereas a lot of people doing 100-mile races, they may find on race day, they actually average a slower pace than they would train on their easy run days during the week. So it's just a little bit of a different kind of angle. So that's kind of the context there. And for me, it made sense that kind of being able to have a fuel source that was very reliable, that didn't require digestion in order for me to use it for the entirety of an event, was a big win if I could make it work. Because one thing that's really kind of interesting with endurance sport, especially as it gets longer, is when you get longer like that, there's a need to eat, hydrate, and stay on top of things like electrolytes. And with that comes potential digestive issues. So if you go to any Ironman or even marathon and ultra marathon, you'll see porta potties all over the place. And those things are there for a reason
Mhm.
because about half the people out there that day are going to have some sort of digestive issue flare up on them. So that becomes kind of part of the plan. Part of the performance is, how do I manage intra race fueling? So that's kind of one side of the equation. The other side is, what do I fuel with on the day to day in order to maximize my training so that I know I'm showing up at that starting line perfectly ready to go, and had all the right workouts that went well kind of in the bank before you start the race. So
Mhm.
that's where it maybe gets a little more tricky, because now I'm introducing phases of the year where I'm potentially going to be doing things that are shorter and faster as I'm trying to build out that side of the training window. And then as I get closer to the race itself, I'm probably skewing more specific to the stuff that I'd be doing on race day. So then I'm getting longer and slower. So it kind of gives me this little bit of a range in kind of how I go about my low carb approach. It'll
Mhm.
be a little bit, it's always within the low carb category, in my opinion. There'll be a few days out of the year where I might flex up to, say, 20, 30% of my intake from carbohydrate. And then during off season or lower intensity training phases of the year, I'll go down as low as 5% and be a little closer to kind of a strict ketogenic diet. And I will like concentrate some carbohydrate around some of the bigger key sessions, especially if they have any amount of intensity in there where I'm going to be going a little more glycolytic. So that's where I kind of confuse people, I think, because they'll pick out a portion of the year and be like, oh, this is what he's doing. And then all of a sudden I'll be in another phase of training. It's like, well, he just changed that. So you get this interesting kind of lifestyle with endurance athletes where, you pick one day out of the year, I might be running 30 miles. You pick another day out of the year, I might be doing nothing because I'm recovering from a 30-mile run or something like that.
How often do you run 100 miles?
Yeah, that's pretty exclusive to race day. The other
Mhm.
interesting thing about ultra marathons is it is so long. It's just not, it's kind of counterproductive to try to do the race distance in training.
Mhm.
So the way to think about it is like, your progress is going to be a cumulative training load, like the amount of work you can put in at given intensities over the course of a long window of time. And that's where the real value is going to come. So that's why running is kind of a patient, consistent person sport. Uh, the
Hmm.
so what you end up having happen is, like, I'll do maybe a couple 100-mile races during the year. Some people will do 4 or 5. That's pretty heavy year for most cases. I find that peaking for 2, maybe 3 is about all you can ask yourself from an optimization standpoint. You start putting more in than that, and you end up in a situation where you're kind of spreading yourself thin, where you're probably not going to have your absolute best performance on any one of them, because you have to kind of be essentially managing a really, really heavy race schedule and not really being able to have the time to put in a structured training build up for all of them. So I'll usually do 6 or 8 ultra marathons in a year that
Uh-huh.
at least a year that doesn't have a pandemic in it. And a lot of those will be kind of what I call B races or training races, where there'll be like 50K to maybe 100K, where I'm just trying to do like a really structured long run, and I'm not going to wring myself dry the way I would if it was a race that I was really peaking for and trying to see exactly how fast I can do it in.
So you're building stamina and ability to run longer. And just take, a person like myself who's just would be starting off. I mean, I used to do 10, 15 without a problem, but from time to time, I know today if I did it, I'd be challenged. Is the restrictive factor the muscle fatigue, the blood flow to those muscles, oxygen carrying, or is it really energy delivery that is the issue? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a combination of all those things. And then I would add just kind of the mental component too. The way I look at it is you kind of have to manage physical energy and mental energy, and then just like your physical breakdown are kind of maybe the ways to look at it. So you have a situation where for the races I'm doing, the oxygen side of thing is a little less important because we're going to be racing at such lower intensity than say like a sport that is just like oxygen premium, like a marathon. A marathon is one where like you want to get that oxygen in as fast and as easy as possible because you can use all of it. Whereas I'll be racing at much lower than where my peak oxygen intake would peak out at. So I don't have to worry quite as much about that side of things. And that's where I think the low carb shines a little bit, because you have this situation where you have a more reliable fuel source and you don't necessarily have the oxygen demand the way you would need it to, the way you would maybe need a carbohydrate in order to get it quicker. So you just give yourself a little bit of an opportunity to potentially stay a little lower on that side of things. And then the physical breakdown is a big one that people usually have to adjust to. I think it's kind of bleeds into the mental side of things, because you'll find times where, hey, my legs are really sore, but I'm mentally strong so I can push through it, versus times where my legs are really sore, I'm hitting a mental weak spot, and it gets rough because then you start focusing on it. So it does become kind of this approach where you're out there on race day and you're going to have these negative thoughts come into your head at certain points. And if you let those start to spiral, they start to impact your performance, because then you start fixating on things that aren't going well, like my sore legs or my slowing pace, or, oh, there's another hill I have to go over. Or if I'm on a track, oh, I got to do another lap around this track. And you start kind of getting this negative spiral, and you have to practice in races or in training when you can manage to kind of game the system a little bit and work on that ability to recognize those and redirect your mind. And it's really interesting because early on your mind is fresh, but I like to look at my mental bandwidth as a fuel tank as well, where, every time I have to like push through a low point, or I have a seed of doubt creep in and have to kind of push that back, I'm spending a little mental currency. So you do want to kind of be in a headspace where you can more easily do that or recognize it sooner, so you don't catch yourself spending a ton of mental energy on any one specific problem, but you're able to kind of move past it and then focus on what's ahead of you. And you do get a situation though where like your mind's fresh in the beginning, you can easily do that. Near the end, mile 70, mile 100 gets a little more difficult. Those negative thoughts tend to pop up a little quicker. The clock seems to be ticking along a little slower, and the miles just aren't clicking off quite as quickly as maybe they did in the beginning. So you have to be kind of prepared to be ready for that sort of stuff too. And that's probably one of the bigger breakthroughs I've had in my own training protocol is learning the right training style is one thing, but then finding ways to be able to practice that mental side of things in training when you're never going to be at a point where you can really have 70 miles in your legs and need to kind of work through that last 30 miles. So what I like to do is kind of do visualization practices while I'm out there doing my longer runs. Usually for like a 100-mile race, I'll be targeting roughly around a 30-mile long run. Sometimes I'll do them on back-to-back days if I'm in that kind of peaking phase for a 100-mile race. And during those runs, I really like to just visualize as if when I start that 30-mile run, I'm at 70 miles on the course, and I'm just visualizing what it's going to take to get from 70 to 100 through that run. So then when I do get to the race itself and find myself in that position, I feel like I have some more close proximity experiences to kind of pull from, even though they weren't the actual 100-mile race itself.
So what type of things, because I think you mentioned the mental, the patience and consistency. Really, I think that's such a key part to this, because I imagine if you're taking breaks in between a lot of these sessions, your mind and your mental state can change. But in the fertility world, there's just such frustrations in this process. One, it's suffering from infertility, but then going through it and it not working. And one of the difficulties is keeping and helping us those keep the mental, persistent, and consistent attitudes. What do you do off the track or on the path in order to keep that in the right state?
Yeah, that's a really, really good parallel there, I think, because it's all about staying positive, right? And I think when you can stay positive, that's where you find yourself staying consistent, staying motivated, and putting in the work you need to do, and doing the right things, making the right decisions in order to put yourself in the best position to have that positive outcome that you're looking for. So what I often find is it's great to sit there kind of at the beginning of a season and say like, okay, here's this really cool goal I'm going to work towards. There's this like 100-mile race or whatever it happens to be. And it's 4, maybe 6 months out. And you get a lot of motivation from that initial decision to kind of pull the trigger and do that event. And then you start getting excited to start the program. And then you get maybe a few weeks into it and you start to notice some of that kind of wane a little bit. Maybe you have a couple bad workouts. You have some negative thoughts about whether you're going to be able to do what you're trying to do. And all sorts of things start to kind of pile up that kind of detract you from that initial burst of motivation and excitement to kind of go down this path. And what I like to do there is before I even start is once I pick that goal race, building out like a scaffolding around like where are some kind of small targets or small wins that I can look back on and say like, okay, I accomplished that today, or okay, I accomplished that this week or this month or this training block right here, so that I have these little benchmarks to focus on. So I'm not trying to look so far down the road that I get overwhelmed, discouraged, unmotivated, and start making the wrong decisions because it feels like overwhelming and letting that negative doubt creep in. So that can be anything from just like, all right, I've got this key workout on Tuesday. Here's my goals there. I'm going to really focus just on that right now and worry about what's next on the plan when it comes, and then go out and have that successful outing and, check that one off and say, okay, I did that. That's one more brick laid towards the thing I'm trying to build here. And focusing on having some of those small goals built into the plan, I think is just a great way to kind of stay positive, stay motivated and excited about what you're doing, and keep that momentum kind of throughout the entire plan versus having it gradually wane before you get to the event itself.
So do you think a lot of this, the motivation to move, our bodies need to move, and interesting, and maybe this is one of the questions in the business that I'm in, and how too much exercise or too hot, when the body is really going at too high of intensity, which may be detrimental for the reproductive system, but there's the mental system, which requires the motion and movement, and exercise can be very motivating to our lives, I think, in so many ways. And maybe ultra marathon, I'm thinking a little bit, because you go at a slower pace, maybe that's too much for most of the fertility patients, but doing something, moving, is very motivating to the spirit of the body.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recognize this every time I have like a forced off day where I get maybe something flares up and I need a rest, or I'm in an off season, or maybe it's even a planned rest day, where it becomes a thing where you actually get so kind of into that activity that you're doing. It becomes such a part of kind of your routine that you feel like it's almost like worse to not have it there. Where I think a lot of times when people first get into some sort of like fitness or movement type journey, it's a little bit of a like, okay, I have to go and do this exercise now. And I think when you can kind of pick a sport, whether that be running, ultra running, or something completely different, you picking something that kind of gets you out the door or gets you into the swing of things, even if it's just initially, I think that starts to gain some momentum over time, to the point where now it feels weird for me not to run versus weird to have to try to like get myself out to go running. And I think that is like what you said, there's like this component of just like this physical movement that our bodies are craving, but we also have this kind of desire to seek comfort too, because we're, trying to preserve ourselves to the degree, but nowadays it's not as needed to, worry about some of that stuff. So you almost have to like build that hardship or build that physical stuff into there, where previously in previous generations, there's no choice. You'd have to move your body in order to
Right.
survive. Now you can sit all day long if you want to in some cases. So I think reigniting that consistency with movement is the key, because once you do it, your body's going to start to crave it, and it helps kind of remedy some of that desire to kind of find comfort when you can build that structure into your lifestyle to have that movement, whether that's, just starting out with a walk. I always advocate with being honest with yourself and starting where you're at. Like
Mm.
if you haven't done exercise very often, or you were injured for a while and weren't able to move as much for whatever reason it is, don't get down on yourself for that. Don't feel bad for yourself because you're not where you want to be eventually, or if you see your friends or other people out there doing more. Start where you're at, and if that's a walk around the block, great. That's enough to get you to square one. Once you're to square one, you have the opportunity to kind of build on that, and then you can start to kind of like recognize that progress. And I think when you do kind of like what I said before, where you build out your plan to have those small rewards, and be proud of yourself for doing it, even if you have to start at a relatively low spot from where you want to be. It'll be rewarding once you kind of get going and see those things kind of play out over time.
Well, I just want to stop a second. We have a few guests on also, and just listening and learning a little opposite and different than my usual conversation, Zach, because again, I promote less exercise and cool the body, but I'm really inspired by much of what you're saying. Start with where you're at, and consistency is really critical to the story. And our bodies are meant to move. And I'm thinking a little bit more as as we move more, we build our vascular beds, which oxygenate our bodies even better, which is key to fueling the cells and preventing sort of degeneration and breakdown in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think like the athlete's way of looking at that, like in the field, would be, if you take me for example, if I get really fit and I'm peaking for, a 100-mile race, and I've got almost 20 years of running experience under my belt, so I might have to do, say, like close to 150-mile training week to peak for a race in order to really hit like a get myself to stress my body enough to make an adaptation or an improvement. But now if I get injured and I don't run a step for 6 months, if I went out and tried to do a week like that, that'd be way overload, and I'd end up hurt again or unmotivated and give up because I'm not starting where I was at. I might have to start something really, really low and kind of keep building up. So that the key is consistency with where you're at, and where you're at can be completely individual. So just tuning into like what you're ready for, and starting from there is, I think, the name of the game.
Motion seems to be motivating for you.
Yeah, I like to move. I think if I wasn't a runner, I'd be doing something else that was, had me on my feet, moving around a lot. And if my job didn't drive that, I'd probably find a hobby that did.
Uh-huh. And tell me a little bit about your wife is involved in your running also, and coaching.
Yeah, so my wife is, she's also an ultra marathoner, and she's been quite successful in her own right. She's had the fastest North American 100-mile on a trail for a few years. She's been top 10 at the Western States 100, which is one of the most competitive 100-milers on the planet, on 3 occasions, and a bunch of course wins and things like that. So where she deviates from me is she was able to manage the professional running career and the professional career together, whereas I had to pick one. She's actually a lawyer who does healthcare compliance as her day job. So she stays quite busy, but still loves to move, loves to run, and she's quite good at it. So it's fun to kind of have a partner who also is interested in that type of a passion.
So is there a why to the ultra marathon? And it's sort of it sounded like in high school, or you were doing track and field, and then at some point you got to the next level. What's your why to the ultra marathon part of it?
Yeah, I think one thing I really learned when I really started to understand just like the actual like ins and outs of certain workouts, where like, to kind of put it simply, in endurance sport, a lot of times you have like these different intensities that you're targeting different times a year. So you have like what they call short intervals, which are just like shorter times where you're running at a pretty hard intensity. You have like moderate intensity stuff, and you have easy runs, you have long run development. So you have all sorts of these different types of workouts that kind of get built out when you're preparing for a race, and you go through a cycle of them. So in my college career, I recognized that the long run that we would do on the weekend was my favorite one that we would do. That'd be the one I'd look forward to the most. So after college, when I didn't have that kind of the team structure there anymore, I just basically started doing all long runs.
Uh-huh,
I kind of cut out everything else. Like, okay, I'm just going to do the one I like if I don't have to do any of these other things. And that kind of led me to ultra marathon. I think was just kind of that passion for that part of the sport. And I also just pretty much right out the gate ended up being a little more competitive amongst my peers with that longer distance stuff. I tended to get a little better as a distance scout longer. So it was something that kind of drew me in from a competitive side of things too, because in college, I was a good runner, but I was very average amongst like talented Division III runners. So it was something where I went from kind of being part of a team, a little bit further down on the totem pole, to someone who could win races and, actually have a sport where I could become a professional at, whereas I wasn't really on the track to become like an Olympic 5K runner or something like that. So there's kind of this dual thing going on where it was my favorite part of the sport.
mhm.
And then it happened to also be the part that I was best at. So it was a kind of a clear direction for me to head at the time. And then I just really got to loving it. I did 350 milers in like a 9-week time frame in 2011. And that's what really hooked me. After that, I was like, okay, this is what I really want to train for. And then that next year in 2012, I started racing ultra marathons exclusively and ended up doing my first 100 miler that year too.
So I want to get back to the food part of
Mhm.
things, and uh, do you fast most of these long runs and drink water and get your minerals that way?
Yeah, I do most of my workouts I'll do fasted during the week. The long runs are where I'll sometimes bring in some fuel, but I usually end up breaking those into kind of two categories. So with my long runs, which typically will range between like 3 and 5 hours, if it's not at a race setting, I'll look at those as kind of my fat adaptation field tests. So if I can go and do like a 3 to 5 hour run on water and electrolytes and feel like my energy is consistent, maybe I even feel better near the end than I did in the beginning as things start to get warmed up. If I have that, that's my sign that my body is operating very well on fat. And I don't necessarily need to pull that lever a whole lot further. So then what I'll start doing is with the remainder long runs, I'll start practicing my intra race fueling strategy and things like that, and just dial that in and make sure that I'm still can expect what I had from the last race with that sort of thing. So that's kind of like the actual intra workout stuff itself. If when I'm kind of just managing my nutrition on the day to day, I don't do a whole lot of like structured fasting
Mhm.
during kind of structured training, just because I kind of fight a little bit of an uphill battle with getting in enough calories a lot of times just because of the
Yeah.
workload. There's certain days where I'm burning 2 to 3 times my resting metabolic rate. So if I did like too much time restricted feeding or fasting, it would just be like kind of stuffing myself so much at the end of the day to catch up. I'd probably end up running a calorie deficit. And if I'm already at kind of my racing weight, I don't necessarily want to do that because I'll end up sacrificing performance. In the off season, though, I'll play around with a little more kind of fasting. I still don't do a whole lot of it structured. I kind of like to do a little more intuitively where,
Mhm.
maybe I'm in off season, I'm not running that day and I wake up, I'm not hungry and I'm just like, staying on top of water and electrolytes and things like that. But I find myself in a position where I can do like a 24-hour fast and not really feel like I'm forcing it or doing it intentionally. But uh, it's kind of a nice status check, I think, in the off season too, because if I have a couple days like that just happen kind of naturally, then, clearly my body's burning fat at a high enough caliber where I'm able to function at a high level doing my day-to-day stuff without feeling like I need to be eating every few hours. So that's kind of a nice little like add on there with it. Generally speaking, though, I'll kind of structure my meals into kind of two big meals during the day is what I typically have, and I'll build those out about as big as I'll let them get before I get into like really my peak training, where sometimes I'll introduce a third meal or a snack or something, some snacks in there when I'm getting it at a really big energy demand and things like that. But I prefer kind of a late morning meal and then an early to mid evening meal, and that's where I kind of end up placing a lot of my intake when I can get away with it.
So I suspect with the amount of running you're doing, there's a huge caloric needs, and so as you said, just getting enough calories in is critical. Do you now? I've heard a little bit about you and using carnivore sometimes and low carb, high fat. Do you have any specific things that you focus on in general, or you kind of move around a little bit?
Yeah, I've played around with a lot of different versions of low carb keto. I think I've been doing it now for over 10 years, so that's given me a lot of time to kind of play around with the different types of foods that would make up those macronutrient ratios that I'm targeting. So it took me maybe a couple of years to really fine tune the macronutrient ratios, where I felt like, okay, this is what I do during this phase of training to feel really good. And once I got that, I got a little more curious about kind of like, well, what happens if I do like mostly plant low carb? What happens when I do mostly meat or animal product low carb? Um, and a combination. So I haven't done a whole lot of like strict carnivore where like it was like completely void of plants for more than like a couple of weeks. I've done a couple like 2-ish week stints with that. But I did in 2019, I spent almost the entirety of that year at around like 95% animal product stuff. So that was probably the closest to, like a carnivore approach or a stricter carnivore approach than I've been. I still lean pretty heavy towards animal products, especially when it comes to protein sources.
Mhm.
And a lot of times the animal product protein sources there's quite a bit of fat that comes along for the ride if you're having like fatty cuts of meat, dairy products, and things like that, which I tend to do all right with. So I don't skimp out on those. So I end up getting a good chunk of my fat calories from animal products then too. And then I'll sprinkle in some plant products. Usually those are what I'll use for my carbohydrate sources, because there's just a lot more or there's really not a whole lot of animal products that deliver too much carbohydrates outside of dairy. And so fruits and like potatoes and things like that will make up a pretty big base of my carbohydrate intake. Uh, and that's kind of how I'll structure things for the most part.
Interesting. So, book wise, do you have any particular books that you get motivation and build mindset in this endeavor?
Yeah, one of my favorite books so far is a book called Peak by a guy named Dr. Mark Bubbs. He'd be a fun guy to talk to for you too. Um he's helped out with a lot of different stuff actually, and one of his kind of bigger projects historically was he'd work with a lot of NBA basketball players, and he was helped out with the Canadian pro basketball teams and things like that. So he wrote this book where it was like, here's where our like exercise science and nutrition has indicated historically. Here's kind of what we're thinking with when we add a little bit of context to the equation, and here are some cool things that we think are coming down the pipeline that we don't necessarily have like a ton of research to back up yet, but we have some pretty cool reasons to think that there's something to it. And he kind of lays a lot of that out there in that book. So I think it's just kind of a really nice uh like way to kind of introduce yourself to the idea of context with these things. Because I know a lot of times it gets easy to say like, oh, well, so and so is eating this way, therefore everyone doing that activity needs to do exactly that, and they just remove all the context and all the nuance entirely, and they don't look at the specific situation. So for me as a coach who coaches individuals, one thing I'm reminded of every day is it doesn't matter necessarily like what the population data says if the individual is not performing under that. So it gives you that opportunity to have to appreciate nuance and have to appreciate context if you want to actually do your job well. So kind of his book really kind of highlighted for me just the wide range of like types of things that people may or may not be able to do given their lifestyle, their particular set of circumstances, and what they're trying to do with sport and activity and things like that.
So I think the motion is the motivation, and consistency, I think, is the part that you've shared is so critical in all of this. And how can people find you, Zach?
Yeah, so I got everything is kind of tied to my website to a degree at zachbitter.com. And there I have kind of links to my podcast, Human Performance Outliers podcast, and my social media channels. I'm most active on Instagram, just at Zach Bitter, and then Twitter at ZBitter.
And do you have any? Do you focus on goals or this the consistency of what you love to do?
Yeah, I like goals. I've had like they kind of evolve, I like to say. I think when I first got into the sport, I had my first, like, what I would call kind of like really successful race where I felt like things just kind of all clicked. And I was like, okay, that one went about as well as I could have expected at this time, was a race I did at the end of 2013 called the Desert Solstice Track Invitational. And I ended up breaking the American record for 100 miles and the world record for 12 hours, which is just distance run in 12 hours. They call them timed events. And that kind of gave me this like new appreciation for the range of different things you can do within this sport, because I
Mhm.
mean there's everything from races up on mountain peaks to races on 400-meter tracks at high schools and things like that, so, and everything in between. So after that race, I started thinking, like, well, maybe it'd be a cool goal to see if I can break the world record for 100 miles, and that became kind of something that was a motivator. And then that kind of evolved a little bit into um to less about making that my primary goal and more about, I just want to really see how fast I can push my body to run 100 miles in a controlled scenario. So when you remove a lot of the hurdles like steep climbs and things like that, and having to navigate aid stations where you have a situation where someone can just be like handing you a bottle whenever you want or handing you
Mhm.
something whenever you need it, and just see how fast you can move when you have all those obstacles removed, kind of a scenario. And that became a huge motivator for me. And that's still a big driver for me. I think I've run some pretty fast 100 milers on controlled surfaces, but I think I can run faster yet. So that's still a big driver for me, is to like, when I do step away from racing, think like, yeah, I got the best out of myself, regardless of whether that's a record or not, is sort of a secondary goal at this point.
So zachbitter.com is the best place to find you. And you're going to continue motivating through motion, uh,
Absolutely.
which I think sounds fantastic. And I think it's important for everyone to know. And I'm crazy on carnivore and keto and these sort of things. But ultimately, each individual has to pick the thing that feels right for them. And as you said, start where you're at. And I think we want to leave it at that and inspire those to check your website out. And if they're interested in coaching, they can find you on at zachbitter.com. Is that right?
Perfect. Yep.
All right. All right. Well, Zach, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me this evening. And I look forward to sharing more and getting motivated by more of what you have to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks a bunch for having me on. It's been a blast.
All right. Look forward to it. Take care.
Bye bye.